Hello, everyone. Welcome to Reconnecting, supporting each other and our students. This is the first module in 5, and we are thrilled to be here to get the conversation going. These modules are designed to focus on learning, stress, and creating healing-centered environments to support each other and our students for the year ahead. So this is a free resource that we hope starts vital conversations or provides energy and enthusiasm for conversations that are already going on, so that we can really focus in on what really matters. My name is Erin Walsh, and I am with Spark and Stitch Institute. So we translate brain science into practical strategies and easy to understand language for parents, families, and educators. And I'll be presenting today alongside my dad, Dr. David Walsh. You want to say hi?
Hello, everyone. Nice to be with you. Thanks for joining Erin and myself.
And we are proud partners of Pegasus Springs Education Collective. And we're excited to be in this first module with you, diving into our brain and learning. We're going to set the table for the rest of the modules by reminding you of how the brain learns, what that miracle perched on top of our students' shoulders allows them to do, and talk a bit about stress and the brain. So we are going to dive right in with my dad, talking a little bit about the brain and how it works.
As Erin mentioned, this miracle on top of our shoulders, you may know that this is actually a vast electrical system. And so right now, every single one of us is generating enough electrical power inside our brain, the equivalent to light a 25-watt light bulb. And these electrical systems are powered by literally billions and billions of brain cells. And those brain cells connect with one another. Some of the connections happen automatically. I call that the hardwiring. That's driven by genetics. But in addition to that, many of the other connections are made through our experience. Neuroscientists have coined a phrase for the importance of experience in literally the wiring of the brain, and that's the phrase, the neurons that fire together, wire together. Now, here's an English translation of that, which underlines how important experience is. And that is, whatever the brain does a lot of is what the brain gets good at. Whether it's math, whether it's science, whether it's language, whatever the brain does a lot of is what the brain gets good at. But Erin's going to talk about a very important part of the brain that is key to learning.
Yeah, and we're actually going to start there. We know that you all are experts. If you have signed up to watch these modules, learning is at the heart of what you do. So rather than start just with the neuroscience, let's start with your experience. And what we'd love for you to do is take out a notebook, a pen, find a piece of paper around you, and just write down the top 5 things that come to your mind in response to this question. So what skills and habits make your students successful learners? And of course, we use the word successful very broadly here, meaning able to set learning goals and meet them. So take a couple minutes or take 30 seconds and write down a couple of those skills and habits. We have done this exercise with educators across North America. And of course, it does not take much time for you to start thinking about those internal skills and habits that unleash learning in your classroom. If we were live in a room, we could hear each other share these back. And our experience tells us that they would be words like persistence, words like focus, like communication, empathy, things like delay of gratification, right? These kind of internal skills and habits that map beautifully onto what we think of in terms of the brain as executive function skills. So just if you haven't taken a deep dive into executive function, let's do a reminder. We often talk about executive function skills as the orchestra conductor in your brain. The orchestra conductor because though it's seated in the prefrontal cortex, this suite of skills allows us to coordinate sort of competing information and impulses, procedures, and memories that are widely distributed throughout the brain, so that we can engage in what we call goal-directed behavior. So whether that is a learning goal, a social emotional goal, a behavioral goal, it's our brain's ability to help us coordinate competing responses and impulses to get towards that goal. Now, we could take a deep dive, but this is a brief module. So let's revisit the main houses of executive function. And my guess is that as we briefly go through these three main houses or categories of executive function, that they map really beautifully onto the skills and habits that you wrote down or that you thought about as you think about what helps students learn and succeed. And so the first house is working memory. This is where we do our real-time thinking. It's where we take information in from our environment, we grab procedures and information from long-term memory, and we juggle them in real time. So working memory is essential to what we call thinking, right? Manipulating information coming in from our environment. So working memory is the first house of executive function. The second is inhibitory control. So those of you who wrote down on your list things like persistence, focus, delay of gratification, we can thank our inhibitory control for those skills. Things like filtering out distractions, whether it's my phone in my pocket or the kids talking or my siblings talking close to me or kids talking at the next table. This is my brain's ability to manage my big feelings. So to manage the impulse, if I'm angry, instead of hauling off and hitting somebody in the face, right? It's my brain's ability to sort of manage that feeling and maybe put a word to it instead. So inhibitory control. If impulse control is what keeps students in the tracks, sort of heading toward their goal, then cognitive flexibility or cognitive agility is what keeps our students from getting stuck in the tracks. It's our brain's ability to think about creative solutions, to try different to try approaching a problem from a different way, to see things from new perspectives. So instead of trying the same thing over and over and over again with the same result, if we're hitting a challenge, we might try to learn a different learning strategy. And so you can see that working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility work together to provide that essential brain power, right? That helps students succeed in the classroom.
One of the ways to think about this is that executive function that Erin's been describing for the past couple of minutes actually is how we learn. And so learning has actually two parts. One part is, of course, what we learn, the content, but how we learn is what executive function has to do. And the reason it's so important is that how we learn has a tremendous impact on what we're able to learn. So this executive function is something that's very, very important and key for any of us, but for our students' ability to learn. And of course, when we're very, very young, our executive function is just beginning. And this graph gives you an idea of how executive function skills build throughout those early preschool years and then into the early school years. And so executive function is something that builds over time. So we don't expect a 2-year-old to have the same kind of inhibitory controls that a 10-year-old has or that a 20-year-old has. So it's something that builds. But we need to remember something that we said earlier, and that is that whatever the brain does a lot of is what the brain gets good at. So even though there's a developmental part of that that kind of happens, experience is key, not just in terms of what we learn, but how we learn. So we get better at it by practicing those executive function skills. And so experience is very, very key, not just in what we learn, but in how we develop the ability to learn executive function. Executive function is so important that we want to make sure that we don't do anything to kind of hinder its development. And there is a growing body of research that shows that there are evidence-based threats to executive function. So this is not just opinion, about how executive function can be threatened, but what do we know from the research? Sedentary lifestyle. So exercise is important for developing those skills. Getting adequate sleep is important. Child-directed play. So play is actually very, very important work, particularly for young children. And then another threat is inappropriate or overuse of technology. That's the kind of the always on, always connected. And then another research-based threat to development of executive function is stress. And that's that last one, we're going to dive a little bit deeper, and Erin's going to talk a little bit about how stress affects the ability of our ability to learn.
Yeah, so, we can't talk about executive function and what might get in the way of it without tackling stress, both too much and too little. We'll spend a bit more time on too much, but we want to think about how do we make sure that we understand the way that our brains respond to stress so that we can manage that in the context of unleashing students' learning brain. So, we've talked about a little bit about the brain as an electrical system. We've talked about, the neurons that fire together, wire together. And the brain is really an incredible thing. It allows us to do all kinds of things, from solving complex mathematical equations to composing music. But it's important for us to remember, even in education, that our brain's number one job is to keep us alive. Its first job is survival. Once we understand that the brain's primary job is to keep us alive, then how it's built and how it responds to things in our environment start to make a lot of sense. Some circuits in the brain aren't actually central to our survival. And so we sort of think of those as sort of back alleyways, maybe. Some of the sort of mildly important might be the main streets. Because the job of the brain is to keep us alive, the number one mega superhighway system in the brain is our stress response system. It's widely distributed throughout the brain so that when we detect threat or stress, our entire brain shuts down from the top down. And meaning from the top down, right from that executive suite, that orchestra conductor, down into our feelings brain, and then into a very reactive space. Now, this makes a ton of sense when you think about the job of keeping us alive. And we can think of some obvious examples where this comes in very, very handy and has kept us human beings kicking for generation after generation. Here in our home state of Minnesota, here's the shores of Lake Superior. We're a landlocked state, but we go to Lake Superior when we want to feel the grandness of things. So, if I'm walking along the shores of Lake Superior and I'm looking out over the horizon, my guess, if I'm feeling pretty safe, is that my cortex, right, my learning brain, my executive center is aglow, right? I'm thinking about my goals, who I want to be, how I'm going to confront challenges, right? And I'm really sort of activating all parts of my brain. And then all of a sudden, snap, right? A crack of a branch. If my brain were designed to continue to walk and consider the higher order of things, abstract thinking, we human beings wouldn't get very far. Instead, my entire body and brain is designed to stop, look, and listen, right? Is it a branch? Is it a bear? It's as if my limbic brain, right, is hijacking my cortex and saying, hey, cortex, deal with this bear, deal with this threat. And then when you feel safe and secure again, you can unleash the power of your learning brain and that orchestra conductor. So this makes a ton of sense in the wilderness. But the challenge is that even though we may not be greeting real grizzly bears or black bears in our communities, on our way to school, in our neighborhoods. But our brains respond to things in our environment in the exact same way, serving us very well to keep us alive, but oftentimes not serving us very well when it comes to learning. Because under stress and threat, I go from being able to absorb new learning, right? That working memory, taking things in from my environment, filtering out distractions, prioritizing competing demands, right? Linking abstract concepts, all of the things that we're hoping to do for our students. We go into very concrete thinking under stress, finally very emotional. And if we feel very under threat, we get into a very reactive state. And so this sort of shutting down from the top down can take on a lot of different faces. Shutting down in the context of stress can have cognitive symptoms, social emotional symptoms, and behavioral symptoms. So this might look like a student who's having a really difficult time paying attention and filtering out distractions, having very fuzzy thinking, difficulty planning, considering consequences, or finding unique solutions to problems. This might take the form of social emotional symptoms, things like really reactive responses, right? Anger, volatility, irritability, or conversely, withdrawal, right? You know, I've been hurt so much, I'm gonna back out of this, right? So sort of shut down, apathy or lethargy. And that quickly can translate into behavioral things like unpredictable or impulsive behavior, volatile reactions. As you look at this list, it can be really easy to misinterpret these symptoms, right? If we don't understand the impact of stress on the brain as we think about students shutting down from the top down, it's easy to write different kinds of stories over what we see in the behaviors of our students. So things like, well, you know, that kid, you know, he's lazy, or he's had it in for me, right? So when we get tired and we get stressed, sometimes we misinterpret some of the clues that our students are experiencing a lot of stress. And so it's important for us to remind ourselves that when it comes to behavior, all behavior is communication, right? And that behavior is not on purpose, but for a purpose. And the purpose of students' behavior is to keep themselves safe and to communicate unmet needs to adults around them. And so understanding, reminding, revisiting the science of stress, the brain and our learning brain, is essential as we consider what does it mean then to be able to look at the context of the world that students are living in right now, the various challenges, and make sure that as we support them in their learning and we work to unleash their cortex, that we're creating as safe and as secure a learning environment as we can. Now, the science of stress, we're going to talk a lot about this in later modules. But as we set the table here, we want to make sure what I've just talked about is too much stress, right? But we want to make sure that we don't leave this module thinking, well, that must mean that all stress is bad. Dad, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, Erin's just been talking about when there's too much stress, and then the very legitimate question that she just ended that session with is all stress bad? The answer to that is no. Stress, you know, if you remember, as we began to talk about stress, we talked about too much, and Erin's just talked about that. Too little stress is not good either. We all need a certain amount of stress. So for example, you know, there's a deadline for me to file my taxes every year. And if I didn't have that deadline, I might keep putting that off. And so as the deadline gets closer, if the deadline for an assignment gets closer, I get a little bit more motivated to make sure I get myself in gear to accomplish whatever tasks I have in front of me. And so even though that can create some stress, that's the kind of stress that helps us. That's actually very good. We might think about this as almost like a muscle. There's a quote that you can see on the screen, and it's by Dr. Bruce Perry, who's one of the leading neuroscientists in the world, really, on the impact of stress on the brain. And he says, just as you wouldn't build a muscle by resting all week and then trying to lift 100 pounds once every Friday morning, you can't build a healthy stress response system by complete protection from stress or occasional exposure to an overwhelming dose. We want our kids to be able to handle stress. And we go back to that, principle that we've repeated a couple times now. Whatever the brain does a lot of is what the brain gets good at. So we want our kids to be able to handle a reasonable amount of stress. And so you might think about it as the Goldilocks principle. We don't want our kids to be subjected to too much stress, because, as Erin said, our brain shuts down from the top down, and so it makes it more difficult to problem solve, to think, etc. We also don't want too little stress. We want kind of just the right amount, the healthy amount. So we don't want our kids, bubble wrapped so that they're protected from any kind of stress. We want them to kind of be able to build those what are called resilience muscles. Dr. Angela Duckworth has talked about the importance of grit in a book that she's written by that very title. And grit is the ability to kind of bounce back from disappointment, to persist even when the going gets tough. And so we want our kids to be able to do that as well. So we want them to be able to handle stress. And so we want that kind of the Goldilocks principle with regard to stress.
Yeah, and we're going to be building throughout these modules, starting conversations that deepen over time, right? So as we set the stage, we want to think about how do we strike this balance, and how do we situate that in the context that students are living in right now. We know that this road from sort of dependent learner to independent learner is not a smooth path, right? That there will inevitably be ups and downs. And our job is to make sure that we are doing everything in our power, whether we are online, hybrid, or in-person learning, to make sure that the stress, the fall is not too deep, right? That it's not so stressful to the degree that we can control it, right? That their brains shut down. But we also don't want to rob them of appropriate levels of stress. And so being able to differentiate, right? Experiencing institutional racism is not an appropriate level of stress. It is all of our job to figure out how do we dismantle those barriers to success. We need to be thinking about the new pressures that are coming along and new uncertainties related to COVID. So the science of stress can help us start to figure out how do we make sure that we're providing safety and security that will allow students to unleash the power of their cortex. How do we make sure that within the context that we have control over, that we're protecting them from too much stress, from the danger zone, where even the best lesson, the best curriculum is going to be really difficult for students to engage with and to learn from, because their brain is shut down. How do we start thinking about providing that safety and security, and then providing appropriate levels of risk that come with being at your learning edge, right? Learning something new. And that balance, and figuring out how do we pay attention to our own stress, when are we in the comfort zone, when are we in the danger zone, attending to that in our students, and talking about the systems and institutions that either help or get in the way of helping unleash the power of every single student's cortex. So we hope that this has been a helpful revisit of the science, a bit of a reminder of how students learn and how our brains respond to stress. We can't wait to see you again. We'll be doing module 2 as well, where we'll be talking about too much stress in the form of trauma. And then we hope that you continue to engage as you build your toolkit for what does this mean for us, and what does this mean for our students in the year ahead. Thanks, everybody.